Chapter 8. Sniffer update at Newshound King is crowned but Queen has no tiara. Apparently royalty doesn't suit everyone. Hail to the King. Kate was eternally grateful to Heidi for running interference with the Howlers. Someone had contacted Heidi about giving Kate a tiara and Heidi had told them how much Kate would loathe the idea of wearing one during the conference. Kate's organization had always functioned democratically, and the idea of promoting her to the status of queen went against all her principles. She just happened to be in the lobby when Duncan was crowned, and she'd heard for him. He didn't have someone like Heidi, whose official job was Kate's assistant at Werewolf, but who served as Kate's right hand were in so many other capacities, including monitoring the Howler movement. So Duncan had been stuck with the crown. Finally she hadn't been able to watch anymore and had left. By the time everyone gathered in the lodge's grand ballroom to open the conference and hold the election, she noticed that Duncan had found a way to ditch the crown. Knowing him as she now did, he'd probably done it with charm and grace so the hapless woofers who'd thought it was such a great idea wouldn't end up with hurt feelings. Even though Kate hadn't been at the lodge to oversee final preparations for today's session, she was pleased to note that the staff had followed the directions she and her grandmother had given them. They'd set up the room with 2 blocks of folding chairs facing the dais and an aisle down the middle. A number of chairs were lined up on the dais as well, and a lectern stood in front of them. Kate had yet to see her grandmother or any of the other luminaries such as Howard Wallace, his sons Aidan and Rourke, or Cameron Gentry, the Pack Alpha from Portland. Howard was the woofer's choice and Kate assumed Duncan would nominate him. She was scheduled to nominate Cameron, who was friendly to the Howler cause. Because neither of them were here yet, Kate wondered if some backroom politicking was going on. She wouldn't put it past her grandmother to engineer something like that. She was curious to meet the Wallace family. They were all registered with the exception of Fiona, Howard's mate. She'd stayed in New York to take care of Emma and Aidan's little girl Iona. Kate looked at the crowd of delegates, a few more than 200 were, with a glow of satisfaction. Her grandmother had been the driving force behind this conference, but she'd turned much of the planning over to Kate. Together, they'd made it happen, and this room full of colorful accents and excited delegates gave Kate a thrill. They were making history this weekend. And now it was time to lead her Howler delegates to their seats. Glancing around, she discovered that Duncan and his followers were already heading toward the chairs on the left side of the aisle. By default she led her group over to the right. She felt strange not being able to go over and talk with Duncan, but she didn't trust herself. She might say something that would let his followers know that she actually liked him. Quite a bit, in fact. She dared not let her followers in on that secret either. Seeing both groups together for the first time fascinated her, though. Woofer males outnumbered females nearly 2 to 1, and the opposite was true of her group. Her followers were predominantly female. She'd known that about her organization before, of course, but she hadn't realized Duncan's group was the polar opposite. She noticed other differences too. Early this summer, her group had adopted a logo and ordered t-shirts, long-sleeved for winter and short-sleeved for summer. Everyone sitting on her side of the room wore a long-sleeved purple shirt with a black Howling Wolf logo surrounded by the group's name, Honoring Our Werewolf Legacy, in white. A few had brought signs to wave, and some wore buttons with a red circle and slash over the WOOF acronym. But for the most part, the shirts made the Howler statement. The woofers, on the other hand, had no shirts, but their side of the aisle bristled with homemade signs which they waved at the slightest provocation. They also had buttons galore. Someone had been busy dreaming up slogans such as "Lose the Legacy" and "Love Your Human Neighbor." A few delegates had created lanyards so they could arrange buttons along the entire length. Those with button-filled lanyards clanked when they moved. Heidi, sitting on Kate's right, leaned toward her. "What a bunch, huh? We really are completely different from them." "Yeah, we're classy and they're not. Oh look, here comes your favorite cousin. Wonder which side he'll sit on. Depends on who he wants to suck up to." Kate turned to her assistant. "Did I just say that out loud?" Heidi grinned. "Yep, but I don't think anybody heard you except me, and I am the soul of discretion." "I know, and I appreciate it more than I can say." Kate sent Heidi an affectionate glance. Heidi laughed. Must be time to ask for a raise. With her short brown hair and a smattering of freckles across her pert nose, Heidi could pass for 18 instead of her actual age of 28. Many underestimated her because she looked so young, but a first-class brain was hidden behind her ingenue facade. Neil's not choosing either side. Kate felt a headache coming on as her cousin proceeded up the aisle, climbed the steps to the dais and crossed to the lectern. He's commandeering the mic. He must have lobbied for that with my grandmother while I was stuck in the cabin. Damn it. Somebody has to run the show, Heidi said. It can't be you because you're the leader of one of the factions. No, but it was supposed to be Grandma Elizabeth. She hasn't declared allegiance to either side, and she... Are you sure about that? I read an interview where Neil said he supports the Woofers and so does his great-aunt. Kate's jaw clenched. He supported the Howlers a few weeks ago. He flip-flops like a spawning salmon. And I know for a fact that Grandma Elizabeth is not taking sides. She made that very clear when I asked her if she wanted a Howler t-shirt. I'm just reporting what he said. Or rather, Angela was reporting what he said. And of course Angela wouldn't bother to check it out with my grandmother. Kate sat there fuming as Neil fiddled with the mic. Grandma Elizabeth would have been the perfect MC. She's not going to accept a leadership position in the council and she's respected by everyone. Somehow Neil talked her out of doing it, the rat. And now it's a fait accompli, I'm afraid. He's assumed the position. So he has. Kate glared at him, hoping he'd look her way, but he studiously avoided doing that. She supposed the delegates would be impressed with him, at least initially. A large were with broad shoulders and an athletic build. He spent many hours in the gym sculpting his body. He preferred gyms with mirrors. He tapped on the mic. May I have your attention? Welcome, delegates. The Stillman Resort and I are proud to host the first annual Werewolf Conference, known to all by now as Werecon 2012. It's an historic event and you should all give yourselves a hand for being here. Kate grimaced. Barf. Put a pleasant smile on your face. Angela's cameramen are prowling around and chances are she'll leap on any chance to catch you scowling. I hate it when you're right. Kate plastered on a silly smile. Better. That looks fake. Because it is. Neil cleared his throat. Our first order of business this morning is electing a president of what will become the first ever Were Council. Do I have any nominations? Duncan stood. I nominate Howard Wallace of New York City. The Woofers greeted that statement with cheers and cries of woof, woof, woof. Kate sighed. They just upstaged us. We don't have a cheer. We can't very well howl for our candidate, can we? Why not? Kate stared at Heidi. Because it would sound stupid? Couldn't sound any more stupid than woof, woof, woof. You have a point. Okay, pass the word around. Are you good at this? Because somebody has to start the howl, and I'll be making the nomination for Cameron. Kate also didn't want to admit that she'd feel ridiculous throwing back her head and howling like an idiot. It was one thing to do it in wolf form, but quite another to do it now. Leave it to me. Heidi leaned toward the person on her right, and whispers circulated quickly through the howler contingent. Meanwhile, Howard Wallace made his way from the back of the room toward the dais amid wild cheering from the woofers. A barrel-chested were in his late 50s. He had high cheekbones, a square jaw, and thick snow-white hair. Kate could understand why Howard commanded respect. She hoped Cameron Gentry had the same noble bearing. Neil shook Howard's hand before turning back to the mic. Do we have any other nominations? Kate stood. I nominate Cameron Gentry of Portland, Oregon. Right on cue, her followers began to howl. It made a terrific racket, but an impressive one. Kate fought the urge to laugh as the woofers, obviously taken by surprise, stared open-mouthed at the howlers who were well howling. For one precious moment she met Duncan's gaze and he gave her a wide smile. He also made a small gesture, one that she doubted anyone else saw. He stuck his thumb in the air for about a second. His approval shouldn't matter to her, but she felt giddy knowing she had it. Cameron Gentry also walked up the center aisle from the back of the room. When Kate caught sight of him, she swallowed her disappointment and smiled encouragingly before taking her seat. But Cameron Gentry was no Howard Wallace. A slim man who was graying at the temples, he had none of Howard's air of command. Instead, Cameron looked like an overbred aristocrat. His glance was haughty, instead of warm as Howard's had been. He surveyed the howlers with a superior smile before mounting the steps to the dais. Although he shook hands with Neil and after that with Howard, neither of the other Wers smiled. Heidi leaned toward Kate. "Methinks our boy is not very popular." "Methinks you're right. But he supports the howler position, so we gotta vote for him." "Yes, we do." Neil called for other nominations, and when there were none, he asked for volunteers to pass out and collect ballots. With only 2 candidates, the balloting went quickly. Kate had arranged for 1 howler, 1 woofer, and 1 undeclared delegate to be present as a staff member counted the ballots at a table in the back of the room. Heidi turned to watch the counting. "If this becomes an annual event, you might have to introduce a more sophisticated system. Like voting booths and electronic ballots?" "Well, no, but something more official than 4 people and a legal pad." Kate laughed. "You're right, but Grandma Elizabeth said we didn't have to get fancy this time, so we didn't. The 3 watchdogs will keep anyone from challenging the results, and I can promise you the resort staffer doesn't care who wins. Grandma Elizabeth won't allow her staff to be political, especially at this conference. I hate to tell you, but I think it's a foregone conclusion. Even if all the howlers vote for Cameron and there's only about 70 of us, there are quite a few undeclared delegates sitting in the back. The woofers will give Howard 60 or 70 votes, and I'll bet the undeclared Wers go for Howard too. He just looks presidential." "When you're right, you're right." Kate wasn't surprised when Howard was named the first president of the first ever Were Council. It was a setback for the howlers, but she'd always heard that Howard Wallace was fair and open-minded. She wasn't giving up hope for her cause, but she grew very tired of hearing an endless chorus of woof, woof, woof. Duncan believed in his cause. Hell, he was passionate about his cause. He'd devoted considerable effort toward building a coalition that would bring a new era of openness and cooperation between Wers and humans. And yet, he hated seeing Kate's disappointment. He didn't want her faction to triumph during this conference, but she'd worked hard too, as hard as he had. She just suffered a defeat, and he could see in her expression that she wasn't happy. Sometime in the past 18 hours, her happiness had come to matter to him. But he was on the horns of a dilemma, because in order for her to be happy, he had to give up the fight. He wasn't going to do that, which meant that he was actively working to make her unhappy. Damn. Once Howard had been declared the president of the fledgling council, which Duncan had thoroughly expected to happen, the delegates had to elect 6 council members to serve with Howard. Nominations flew furiously, punctuated by a chorus of woofs or howls depending on the candidate. Duncan anticipated that he'd be one of them, and so would Kate. He wasn't sure how that would work out, but at least he'd have an excuse to be near her, instead of sitting on the opposite side of a large room. That had been no fun at all. When the dust finally settled and council members had been nominated and voted on, the council consisted of Duncan, Kate, Jake Hunter from Alaska, Knox Trevelyan from Seattle, Nadia Henderson from Chicago, and Giselle Landry from Las Vegas. Duncan was the only international member. He assumed that was because a fair number of the delegates were from the U.S. and would logically vote for U.S. delegates. Howard had taken over the mic from Neil, thank God. Duncan wasn't sure he could have taken much more of Neil's self-congratulatory style. Interestingly, Elizabeth Stillman had not yet addressed the conference goers. Duncan hadn't met Kate's grandmother, and he was becoming curious. He'd had a short but terrific visit with both Aidan and Rourke Wallace during the break to count the votes for the council members. He'd met Aidan's mate, Emma, the novelist he'd interviewed online for his book, and Rourke's mate, Abby, a redhead who was recovering from a bad sunburn after accompanying Rourke on one of his archaeological digs in Africa. Both Wallace brothers would help Duncan's cause, and with their father as the new president of the Were Council, Duncan considered his chances of success were good. He doubted that Kate had the same confidence. He longed to talk with her, but that might not be possible. Angela Sapworthy prowled the perimeter of the hall, searching out juicy tidbits. He didn't want her to find any that involved either him or Kate. After announcing the names of the new council members, Howard asked for a recess so that the newly elected representatives could meet and decide on a course of action. Duncan's hopes shot up. He might finally have a chance for a few quiet words with Kate. Howard motioned his 6 council members to the front of the dais. There's a small meeting room right through that door. He pointed to his left. The staff has put some coffee, tea, and a few snacks in there. Make yourselves at home and I'll be right along. Those who don't know each other, introduce yourselves. Duncan glanced over at Kate. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? Sure. Her smile was brief, as if she didn't dare meet his gaze for too long. He understood. They had a potentially volatile situation and had to be careful. But he hoped that she knew when he'd mentioned the coffee he wanted. To remind her of the mug she'd brought him first thing this morning, when all she'd been wearing was a robe, and he'd worn nothing at all. I know the presidential election didn't go the way you wanted, he said. No, it didn't. She gave him a quick glance. What the heck did you do with that crown? I told them I was afraid it would get damaged, so I took it up to my room for safekeeping. My plan is to keep it there for the duration. She laughed softly. I knew you'd think of something. I must have looked like the egomaniac you've accused me of being when I let them put in on me. I saw you on the far side of the lobby taking in the whole damned spectacle. I didn't think you looked like an egomaniac. You looked like a were trapped in an impossible situation. He sighed with relief. I'm glad you didn't think I liked the idea. Did the howlers try a stunt like that with you? They wanted to, but my assistant headed them off so I didn't have to. Excuse me for interrupting, but I want to make sure I introduce myself to you, Kate. Jake Hunter fell into step beside her. I hope this isn't a private conversation. Not at all, Kate said immediately. Yes, it bloody well is. But Duncan had no right to say that. I didn't join your howler movement because I live in a fairly remote area of Alaska and my internet reception is dicey, Jake said. But I fully support your cause. Thank you, Jake. That's good to know. Duncan found himself bristling. Who did this Jake think he was butting in? Like that? Then reason reasserted itself. Jake was a fellow council member and a supporter of HOWL. Of course he'd want to connect with Kate. Except Duncan didn't want him to do that. Jake had the makings of a rival. From his build, he must be a lumberjack or some other outdoorsy occupation. His dark, wavy hair hung to his shoulders and his green eyes were trained with far too much interest on Kate. So Jake, Duncan said, did you leave your mate back home tending to your offspring? No, Jake said. I haven't been lucky enough to find the right were. Alaska's population is small, and its population of wers even smaller. But that doesn't mean I'm interested in mating with a human female. That's just wrong. I doubt the Wallace brothers would agree with you, Duncan said. I'm sure they wouldn't, but I consider their actions dangerous to the general were population. As you may or may not know, all the packs in North America, including the Wallaces, are descended from the Alaskan wers. When Kate talks about honoring our legacy, she's referring to the traditions handed down from those first wers in Alaska. That's important. Duncan wasn't about to be intimidated by tradition or Jake Hunter. As a Scotsman, I'm very aware of the value of tradition. Can be a warm and wonderful part of any culture. But when it becomes a straitjacket that limits the options of that culture, then, MacDowell, you're not going to convince me, so you might as well save your breath. And we're here, Kate said as they reached the door. Shall we go in and have some coffee? She walked through the door. Duncan eyed Jake as they stood shoulder to shoulder, neither one ready to let the other go in first. Excuse me. A tall, willowy female with dark red hair approached. She wore a purple howler t-shirt. I'm Giselle Landry from Vegas. Is there a problem? No, Duncan and Jake said together as they quickly separated to allow access to the room. I'm Jake Hunter, by the way. Jake held out his hand to Giselle. And I support the howler cause. Nice to meet you, Jake. She shook his hand. And I'm Duncan MacDowell. Duncan extended his hand and wished he'd done it before Jake. Giselle accepted his handshake. Oh, I know who you are. Everyone does. Think you're cute but crazy. Can't go along with your ideas at all. Sorry. Well then, Giselle, Jake said. You and I have something in common. How about sharing a cup of Java with me? I'd be delighted, Jake. The two of them went inside. I heard Howard say coffee and I could use a jolt of caffeine. The female who approached was easily as tall as Giselle, but she had long black hair that hung straight down her back and a model's sense of style. She wasn't wearing a purple shirt or buttons proclaiming any allegiance. By process of elimination, Duncan figured out who she was. You must be Nadia Henderson. I am. Her handshake was warm. And you're Duncan, of course. Aiden and Emma are big fans. You know them. She laughed. I keep forgetting that news doesn't always travel across the ocean. I was pledged to Aiden for years, but then he ended up choosing Emma instead. You don't seem very upset about it. I was at first, but they're so happy. Besides, I found my own true love. Aiden's cousin Quentin. It all worked out. So how do you feel about we're human mating, since you obviously know the Wallaces so well? I'm not sure if the human is completely trustworthy like Emma, or for that matter Rourke's mate Abby, then fine. But I think there are some dangers there if the wrong person finds out about us. Hey folks, are we going to debate this issue out here or go in where there's coffee and eats to sustain us? The last council member came over and greeted them both with a smile. I'm Knox. He shook hands first with Nadia and then with Duncan. Knox Trevelyan. Nadia pointed a finger at him. You own a commuter flight operation in Seattle, don't you? I do. And you were the one who transported that Bigfoot-mated pair for my friend Rourke Wallace. Knox wrinkled his nose. I was. Smelliest job I've ever had, hands down. Hope never to have to do that again. Now that's something I want to hear about, Duncan said. Let's go in. That was my plan. Knox gestured for Nadia to precede him. As Duncan started through the door, he was brought up short by Howard's voice behind him. Wait a minute, Duncan. I need to ask you a favor. Oh. Duncan stopped and glanced at him in surprise. How can I help you? I've been talking to Elizabeth, and the two of us have come up with a plan. Hope you'll like it. Let's hear it. We have two strong factions at this conference, and somehow we need to make sure those factions don't divide us before we even have a name for the organization we're trying to form. I think we need a mission statement, and you're a writer. I'd be more than happy to take a crack at it. Howard's election as president was already paying dividends. He'd write a mission statement that helped pave the way for more openness between Wers and humans. He began crafting it in his head. That's good to hear. But Elizabeth and I thought it would be beneficial if you and Kate worked on it together. He went very still. Together. I know it's a bit unorthodox, and of course I have to make sure Kate's willing. But Elizabeth and I thought if the two of you crafted the statement, then both howlers and woofers would accept it. Duncan was no longer thinking about the mission statement. That issue had been eclipsed by the prospect of spending time alone with Kate, time that had been blessed by none other than the council president himself. Howard studied him. You seem a bit taken aback. Do you think you can handle the job? Duncan had no idea. The potential problems could be enormous. They might end up arguing endlessly about the wording, but at least he'd have a reason to be with her. And maybe, just maybe, they'd actually settle their major differences. Miracles did happen. He nodded. Absolutely. If Kate agrees, that is. I think she will, especially if I mention that her grandmother recommended her for the job. Now let's go get a cup of coffee. Duncan gestured toward the open door. After you, Mr. Wallace. Howard, please. We'll all be working very hard, and I don't want anyone standing on ceremony. All right, Howard. But you still get to go ahead of me through that door. That much is bred into me. Howard chuckled. Fine. Once Howard was through the door, Duncan closed his eyes and clenched his fist. In victory. He had been assigned to work with Kate. Jake hadn't been assigned the job. Knox hadn't either. Just him. Life was definitely looking up. Chapter 9. Sniffer update at Newshound. Kate Stillman and Duncan MacDowell to co-author were organization's mission statement. WTF? Gridlock. As Howard proposed his plan to Kate, she carefully avoided looking at Duncan. He stood in a far corner chatting with Knox Trevelyan as the council members waited for Howard to finish his conversation with Kate. No one had taken a seat at the rectangular wooden table for 8 that dominated the center of the room. I realize I'm asking a lot. Howard sipped black coffee absently, but his gray eyes were trained on Kate and only Kate. She held a cup of coffee in both hands but didn't drink it. Her tummy was already churning from this unexpected suggestion. Judging from Howard's ability to focus so completely on her, she had no trouble imagining him as the successful head of Wallace Enterprises of New York, one of the wealthiest werewolf conglomerates in the world. His personal charisma aside, he was better known than Cameron Gentry, so his election as president probably had been assured from the beginning. Time is an issue, Howard continued. Not only is the schedule packed with seminars, but we've had to eliminate most of the breaks to make up for the late start. Which is because of Duncan and me. I'm sorry we delayed everything. Couldn't be helped, and there was no point in starting until you were both here. Once we knew when to expect you, we had everything under control. But I don't think you and Duncan will have any chance to hash this out during the day, and I'd like to have a rough draft by tomorrow. When he agreed to do this, I didn't think to mention to him that it would have to be after hours. So you're suggesting we work on it tonight? She did her level best to make that sound like a sacrifice when inside she was spinning with excitement. They had an excuse to be alone tonight. Yes, they'd have to work on this project. But when they'd finished, she pushed the resulting image out of her mind as she felt her cheeks grow warm. I hate to ask it of you, but I think it's the sensible solution. Yes, throw me in that briar patch. I agree, and I'm sure Duncan will too. She hadn't a doubt in her mind. Good, then it's settled. I want the two of you to get away from the warring factions and just talk to each other about how we can unite this group under one banner. If the two of you can't come to an understanding, then we have no chance to create something worthwhile this weekend. We'll do our best. She clutched her coffee cup and worked to subdue the trembling produced by a sudden adrenaline rush. Howard lowered his voice. I realize you each have to play to your base with all the sniffs and so on, but I have confidence in a more meaningful dialogue. You mean something that can't be said in 140 characters or less? Exactly. I've known your grandmother for years. She assures me you're an intelligent and sensible were. I respect your convictions, Kate, but a stand off between woofers and howlers wouldn't be constructive for our brand new organization. Her joy dimmed a little. Yes, she was being given a chance to spend time alone with Duncan, but what were Howard's motives for that? After all, he had two sons who'd mated with human females. One howler had been elected to the council, Giselle, and one howler sympathizer, Jake. Nadia wore no identifying buttons, but she couldn't be a strong woofer supporter, or she'd have indicated that somehow. Knox was also without campaign buttons. Maybe Howard thought the scales were balanced in the howler's favor, and he hoped Duncan could change her thinking. She cleared her throat. I hope you're not suggesting that I go along with the woofer proposals. I can't do that. And it's not only because I lead an organization that opposes the woofers. My personal belief is that we need to maintain war secrecy. I know. I don't expect you to adopt the woofers' philosophy, nor do I expect Duncan to abandon everything he believes and take up the howler cause. I want each of you to get creative. Think outside the box. Get beyond howlers and woofers if you can. Kate knew of only one place where she and Duncan had accomplished that, in bed. Tonight's work session might be more complicated and difficult than she'd thought at first blush. Howard was handing them an important assignment, and he wanted it completed by tomorrow morning, and completed with imagination and flair. I can tell you're already considering the possibilities, Howard said with a smile. That's good. He gave her arm a squeeze. Let's get this council meeting underway. He turned to the group. Gather round the table, everyone. We have several important items to discuss before we dive back into the conference events. Kate chose a seat in the middle of the long side of the rectangular table. She had a feeling Duncan had waited for her to sit down before taking his place opposite and one over from her. That put him across from Jake, who sat on Kate's right. Giselle pulled out a chair on Kate's left. With two remaining chairs, Nadia took the one next to Duncan and Knox sat beside her. Kate didn't believe for a moment that the seating choices had been random. Her side of the table contained howler sympathizers, and Duncan sat with the uncommitted members of the council. Howard claimed a chair at the head of the table, flanked by Knox on one side and Giselle on the other. First order of business, Howard said, is to thank all of you for being willing to serve for the next year. We'll be feeling our way in the beginning, because we don't have any organizational rules in place yet. Nadia, would you agree to be our secretary and take some basic minutes? Of course. Howard glanced around the table. Anyone object to that? I happen to know Nadia pretty well, and she's capable. She's also still on the fence regarding the big issue facing us, so I think having a neutral person acting as secretary would be helpful. Works for me, Duncan said. Everyone else, including Kate, voiced their agreement. Nadia reached into her slim briefcase and pulled out a netbook. I'll make sure you all see the minutes before they go out to the delegates. Does everyone have a smartphone? Mine's over in the corner getting charged, Duncan said. Mine's in the other corner, also getting charged. Kate's statement on the heels of Duncan's made everyone laugh. Apparently they were all thinking about last night's sniffer war. The other 4 council members brought out phones and held them up for Nadia to see. She nodded. Great. Make sure I get everybody's contact info before we leave. Here. Howard chuckled. Told you she was efficient. Second big thing is that we have a fledgling organization but no name for it. I'll take suggestions from this group, and if we need to, we'll also take suggestions from the delegates. Something short, easy to remember. Knox leaned back in his chair. Wow. I grant you that it's an intimidating exercise, and we might not come up with it immediately, Howard said. We can certainly spend the rest of the day thinking about it, but no, he means WOW should be the name. Kate looked at Knox with new respect. Worldwide Organization of Werewolves. Am I right, Knox? If so, I like it. That's it. Knox glanced at Howard. But somebody might have a better idea. I've been thinking about this since yesterday when I realized we had no name yet. I like WOW, Duncan said. In fact, I can't imagine calling it anything else. Howard nodded. It fits the criteria of being simple and easy to remember. And it accurately describes us. Anybody have something else? I think WOW is excellent, Giselle said. I say let's present it to the delegates in the morning. I predict they'll love it. They will, Jake said. It certainly has my vote. Good job, Knox. I'm in favor too. Nadia lifted her fingers from the keys of her netbook and glanced around the table. I think that's all of us. Good. Howard sat back in his chair. We might as well follow parliamentary procedure, so let's have a motion, a second, and an official vote. Nadia typed away as the motion was made, seconded, and unanimously approved to propose the new name to the delegates in the morning. Excellent. Howard looked pleased. Next, I want to announce that Kate and Duncan will be working together on a mission statement for what we can assume will be called WOW. I already knew that, Giselle said. You did. Howard frowned. I suppose you overheard me talking to Kate. No, it was on Sniffer before I came in here. Angela Sapworthy scooped you. I guess. I'll scroll through and find it again if you'd like to see what she said. Yes, I would. Thanks. A muscle twitched in Howard's jaw. I'm not sure how. That was leaked before I'd even talked with Duncan and Kate about it. Here you go. Giselle handed over her phone. Howard read the sniff and sighed. I'd like to request that all of you use caution when speaking with Ms. Sapworthy. I'm still not sure how this got out, though. Elizabeth Stillman and I were the only ones who know. Wait, I think. Perhaps Neil might have been in the room. Now that I think about it. Kate started to say something but then decided to hold her tongue. Let Howard come to his own conclusions about Neil. But she would bet anything he'd sent the information to Angela in his continued attempt to curry favor with the reporter. Howard returned Giselle's phone. Thanks for making me aware of it. Anything else shows up on Sniffer or the Wereweb that you think I need to know about, please contact me. I try to keep tabs on it, but sniffs have been raining down on us like confetti at New Year's Eve. It's entertaining as hell, but it makes it tough to keep up and have a life. I take responsibility for some of that sniffer blitz, Duncan said. Obviously, so do I, Kate said. I'll dial it back. Howard gazed at each of them. I'd appreciate that. In fact, here's an idea. When you settle down to work on that mission statement, I'd advise both of you to turn off your phones and your Wi-Fi. Block out anything that's liable to distract you from the job you need to do. Turn off their phones and Wi-Fi? Go into total isolation again so that nothing and no one could interrupt them? Kate nodded at Howard and hoped that her expression was a total blank. No way was she looking at Duncan. Duncan coughed. What if you or some member of the council needs to reach us? We won't, Howard said. Writing that mission statement is job number 1. Nothing that comes up short of the hotel catching on fire is more important. Right now, the rest of us will handle things so that you two can concentrate. Kate took a deep breath. Understood. So maybe she and Duncan wouldn't be playing bedroom games tonight, at least not until they'd finished the mission statement. No telling how long that would take if they could manage it at all. Their assignment might work better than an old-fashioned chastity belt. Duncan hoped that Nadia had taken really good notes for the rest of the council meeting because he barely remembered what was said. Various projects were suggested, including conducting a Were census and creating a central database from the census results. Jake had been against that because he said the very existence of a database would put Wers at risk. Duncan recognized that kind of paranoia regarding the safety of Wers. He'd dealt with it in Scotland too. Many Wers couldn't believe that they would be in a power position once their presence was known. Yet why wouldn't they be? They had economic clout and nearly all Wers were fine physical specimens as well. They weren't second-class citizens now and wouldn't be once their shape-shifting ability became common knowledge. He was glad that Kate hadn't joined in Jake's rant about the database being a security issue. But for all he knew, she agreed with Jake. She'd stayed fairly quiet during the council meeting, but then he had too. At first he'd thought the idea of meeting with Kate privately to draw up a mission statement was great. After despairing of ever being alone with her again, he'd been handed a golden opportunity. But there was a catch, a big one. Howard expected them to come up with a mission statement they could both live with. Duncan knew himself fairly well, and he was beginning to know Kate. They were both conscientious, and neither of them would feel right jumping into bed until they'd written the mission statement. Duncan would love to believe that they could come to a quick and easy agreement on how to word it. He'd love to believe that, but he didn't. At last Howard adjourned the meeting. Nadia keyed everyone's information into her netbook and all the council members exchanged phone numbers too. Then they began dispersing to attend one of several seminars taking place in various meeting rooms. Duncan had intended to talk to Kate about plans for tonight, but she was in some deep discussion with Jake. Oh well, he could text her later on. Leaving the room, he took out his phone and pulled up the revised conference schedule. He'd promised his brother Colin he'd attend the panel discussion titled Half and Half: The Challenges and Joys of Mixed Blood Offspring. Colin's mate Luna was a mixed blood Were, and she just found out that she was pregnant. Colin and Luna's offspring could end up being human Were, or a mixture of both, because Were offspring looked and behaved like human offspring until they reached puberty. Their parents had to wait until then before they discovered how the genetics had worked out. Duncan thought it was a fascinating prospect, ripe for promoting greater understanding between Wers and humans. But Colin wasn't into the whole grand experiment the way Duncan was. Colin was nervous. As Duncan consulted a large brass placard on the wall to find out which direction he should go to sit in on that panel discussion, he picked up Kate's scent. Glancing over his shoulder, he watched her approach. She looked damned good in purple. Even if the logo on the front of her shirt stood for the opposition, he liked the way her breasts showcased that howling wolf. He hadn't had a chance to change clothes, so he was grateful she'd washed everything except his wool slacks. The cabin seemed a million miles away now. Yet he only had to glance into her blue eyes to remember what loving her had been like. You look good in that color, lass. She grinned. Everyone looks good in this color. That's why we picked it. You'd look good in it too, woofer. I don't think so. He gazed down at her and fought the urge to stroke her cheek. The shirt's not so bad, but there's a splotch of something on the front that would clash with my principles. Where's your t-shirt? As I'm sure you could tell when we were gathered in the grand ballroom, my crowd doesn't go in for the shirts. They'd rather have the buttons and the signs. The males think t-shirts are too girly. Beats having a bunch of buttons pinned to your chest or hanging around your neck clanking all the time. We agree on that. He gripped his phone to remind him that he must not touch her. He probably shouldn't even be standing this close, but he couldn't seem to help it. So what was the deep discussion with Jake all about? He doesn't want me to sell the howlers down the river. He knows you're a persuasive sort of Were, and he's worried that you'll get the better of me. That's because he doesn't know you very well. He could stand here forever, looking into her eyes. You're as likely to get the better of me. I doubt it. But we need to come up with a plan for tonight. And don't we find ourselves in a fine fix? We'll be together, but we'll have one hell of a job to do. Couldn't have said it better, lass. I foresee tonight being pure torture. Unless, of course, you agree to see things my way from the start. Any chance of that? Nope. Didn't think so. So where shall we conduct this test of wills? Howard suggested we block out all distractions. She rolled her eyes. Like that's possible. Little does he know the distraction you present to me. Or that you present to me, woofer. But I suggest we use my suite. It's more like an apartment than a suite. There's plenty of room, almost as much square footage as the cabin, actually. He lowered his voice. How big is your bed? It may not matter. We could be locked in battle until dawn. I'd rather be locked in a different way. He sighed. But we have to write that bloody mission statement, and I don't imagine it will be easy. Now there's an understatement. Tell you what. Let's say if either of us has spare moments during the day, we'll start jotting down ideas for the statement. Then we can share what we have. Who knows? Maybe we'll be thinking along the same lines. He laughed. You're a dreamer, but I'll jot down some ideas. What time? Let's see. She scrolled through the schedule on her phone. With the late start, the last session ends at 6. Let's meet at 7. Sure. That'll give me time to slip into my suit of armor. Where's your suite? Top floor, end of the hall. 3300. I have a fireplace. Don't you go making it cozy, Kate. Don't be pouring wine and lighting candles. Wouldn't think of it. You should also put on something bulky and ugly, if you can manage that. Okay. She chuckled. And put your hair up in rollers. Wait, I know what you should do. Do you have any of that green glop that females slather on their faces as a beauty treatment? Her chuckle had morphed into outright laughter. No, I don't, but even if I did, you'll show up looking your normal gorgeous self, since I seriously doubt you actually have a suit of armor. And armor would only add to your appeal. Anyway, it's not fair if I make myself ugly and you don't. I could belch a lot. That should help. Oh my God. She laughed harder. Yes, that would help. See that you do. And chew with your mouth open. That's especially disgusting. What's all the hilarity about over here? Inquiring minds want to know. Angela Sapworthy appeared like an evil queen out of a fairy tale. The snow had been removed from her spiked hair, and her makeup was repaired. Duncan's mind went blank. Apparently Kate's didn't. Why, Angela, you're just the one I wanted to see. You have to hear this. You can put it on Sniffer. Oh. Angela's eyes took on an avid gleam. I was just telling Duncan the best joke. These 3 werewolves walk into a bar, and the first one says, "Oh, I've heard it." Angela looked disappointed. That's the one where the punchline is something about a fuzzy navel. Yes. Isn't it hilarious? The first time, I suppose. Anyway, never mind. I thought you might be talking about something interesting. Nope. Kate shrugged. Sorry. Just telling werewolf jokes. Then I'm off. Angela strolled away. Duncan glanced at Kate with admiration. Nice work. Thanks. I've never heard that joke. How does it go? I have no idea. I was making it up as I went along. I figured there had to be a joke that started out like that. If I'd had to keep going, I was going to make up something stupid, but I got lucky. He was sure his admiration for her would be obvious for anyone to see, but what the hell? You're amazing, Kate. Don't let Angela hear you say that, or we'll be in big trouble. Bigger than we already are? Good point. So, I'll see you at 7. He nodded. You will. And God help me, I'm looking forward to it. I know. She smiled at him. Me too. After she walked away, he stood staring at his phone as if he had important messages on it, but he didn't see the phone at all. All he could see was Kate's smile. The image of it stayed with him for the rest of the day. Chapter 10. Werecon 2012. Howlers gain momentum. Exclusive report for Werewolf Celebrity Watch by Angela Sapworthy. Denver. There's a new kid in town, and his name is Jake Hunter. This reporter admits that she has a soft spot for the mighty Wers in the forefront of the woofer movement. When confronted by sexy wolves like Duncan MacDowell and the 2 Wallace brothers Aidan and Rourke, one can be forgiven for joining the rousing chorus of woof, woof, woof. But the Howlers have a new champion from the wilds of Alaska, the birthplace of all were packs in North America. If Jake's a typical Alaskan were, this reporter needs to go north. Jake offers guided tours through the Alaskan wilderness, and note to all were females, he's single. He also believes strongly that Wers were intended to mate only with Wers. That's good news for those of us who are worried that the Woofers' doctrine would mean that human females could snap up all the good Wers. No human female will be getting Jake Hunter. And that's reason to celebrate. Now that Jake is one of 6 council members who will help steer a course for all wars in the coming months, you can bet Jake will be advocating a return to werewolf mating along with other traditional values. And wherever a 6'5" 200-pound were who looks like Jake Hunter leads, this reporter is willing to follow. And don't forget to follow me, Angela Sapworthy, on Sniffer at Newshound. I'm your eyes, ears, and nose for Werecon 2012. Kate spent her day being visible, connecting with howlers she'd only met online, and attending seminars geared toward the howler movement. In the last scheduled hour of the day, she led a seminar entitled Letting the Howl Out, Rededicating Ourselves to Werewolf Traditions. The room was filled with mostly females in purple shirts. Jake Hunter sat quietly throughout the seminar. As the session neared its end, Kate introduced her 2 fellow council members, Giselle in her purple howler shirt and Jake, who wasn't wearing the shirt but supported the cause. May I say something? Jake asked. Be my guest. Kate liked Jake and thought he brought a much-needed strong male presence to the movement. He stood up, all 6'5" of him, with his collar-length dark hair and his flannel shirt and leather vest. He looked as if he'd just returned from the wilderness. Every female in the room gave him her full attention, and the males looked at him with obvious respect. I think we have a real opportunity here, he said. Kate got the ball rolling by founding HOWL. As I told her I would have joined, but where I live the internet is still spotty. But I'm here this weekend and was lucky enough to be elected to the council. That gives us 3 seats out of 6. Applause quickly turned to howls. Kate looked over at Heidi, who was probably responsible for starting the howling. Then she laughed and joined in. Howling was good. It reduced stress and brought the group together. When the noise died down, Jake continued. Even more important than the strong howler presence, though, is the lack of dedicated woofers on the council. Duncan MacDowell is the only one. The others are still undecided, although I think we all know that Howard Wallace must surely support the woofers, at least privately. That news was met with groans. The Wallace pack posed a major threat to the howlers, and they all knew it. I'm asking all of you to stay strong and promote our cause. Don't be discouraged because Howard won the presidential race. Kate has been assigned to work with Duncan to create a mission statement for the organization, and I know she's going to fight for our position while she does that. Jake challenged her with his piercing green eyes. I plan to do exactly that, Jake, Kate said. More howls greeted that statement, and the session ended. Kate suspected that Jake had intended his little speech to put pressure on her so that she wouldn't cave as she and Duncan crafted the mission statement. Because he was a male and very perceptive, she wondered if he'd picked up on the sexual tension between her and Duncan. She wouldn't be surprised if he had. Jake would never suggest such a thing, of course. He might not even be completely sure that his suspicions were correct. But instinct told her that. On some level, Jake sensed that Duncan had breached her defenses. But she breached Duncan's defenses as well. Duncan was as susceptible to her as she was to him, and she should keep that in mind. He might want her to greet him tonight looking ugly, but she wasn't about to give him that advantage. When they met, the playing field should be as even as she could make it. Her meeting with him would take place very shortly. Before it did, however, she wanted to pay a long overdue visit to her grandmother. Elizabeth Stillman had flitted through the conference all day, but Kate had never managed to be in the same place at the same time. Besides, the question she wanted to ask couldn't have been voiced with others milling around anyway. She thought her grandmother might have some questions for her as well. She hoped they wouldn't veer too close to the matters Kate wanted to keep private. After 6 in the evening, Elizabeth could usually be found having a glass of exceedingly expensive red wine in her suite, a replica of Kate's on the opposite end of the 3rd floor. Kate pressed the doorbell, which sounded a melodious chime. Her grandmother hated buzzing doorbells. A maid with graying hair dressed in a smart burgundy pantsuit answered the door. Hello, Kate. Hello, Sally. Is my grandmother in? The maid smiled. You know she's always in at this time of the evening unless she's on a trip. Will you be staying for a glass of wine? No, thank you. I just want a few minutes of her time. Sally. Elizabeth's voice carried well. Is that Kate? I was hoping she'd come. Send her right in. A twinkle in her eye, Sally gestured for Kate to head on into the suite's living room. Kate walked through the entryway and into the living area, her suede boots sinking into rose-colored carpet so plush and soft it would make a perfectly fine surface for sleeping. Her grandmother believed in luxury, from the gold brocade drapes at the windows to the white velvet slipcovers on the furniture, covers that were washed weekly to maintain their pristine condition. Kate. Elizabeth put down her wine and rose from her favorite wingback chair by the fireplace. I was hoping you'd come. Kate hugged her grandmother, who at 75 had the face and figure of a woman at least 20 years younger. She'd lost her soulmate when they were both only 60, and although Elizabeth could have searched for another, she'd chosen not to. She liked to say she'd had the best and anything else would be trading down. Elizabeth Stillman was tall, 5'9" in her bare feet, and she usually took off her shoes the minute she stepped inside this suite. Her hair was a blend of several shades of blonde that looked quite natural thanks to an excellent hairdresser, and she'd had at least one facelift that Kate knew about. She preferred to dress in jewel tones and loose garments that floated around her. When she moved, she was, as Kate noticed whenever she paused to look with a stranger's eye, beautiful woman. But anyone meeting her had better not assume that her beauty was the whole story. Elizabeth was extremely intelligent and a skilled politician. She'd run the Stillman pack ever since taking over from her father 30 years ago. She hadn't slowed down a bit, and even though Kate expected to step into the position eventually, it wouldn't be any time soon. Her grandmother waved her to the companion wingback sitting in front of the fire. Aren't you having wine? No, of course you're not. Howard told me you're meeting with Duncan tonight to craft the mission statement. Is that a brilliant idea or what? I'm not sure if it was mine or Howard's, but I'm going to take credit for it. It is a brilliant idea. Challenging but brilliant. Kate sat in the chair, but didn't settle into it. And I only have a few minutes. Duncan's coming to my suite at 7, and I've ordered food to be sent up. Just food. Elizabeth's eyebrows arched. You'll need wine too. I can't imagine how you'll come to any agreement on the wording if you each don't have a few glasses of wine. If I decide we need that, I have some in the suite already, but I think we may be better off just sticking with water and coffee. Could be a long night. Instead of picking up her own wine, Elizabeth sat in her chair and gazed at Kate for several long seconds. And what of your first long night with this? How did that go? You know I'm burning with curiosity. Fine. It went fine. I got a report from Ryan around for this afternoon that the steward's window has been replaced. I'm not talking about windows. I'm talking about whether you and Duncan managed to get along all right, disregarding those ridiculous sniffs, of course. It was the question Kate had been dreading, and she didn't want to dwell on it for long if she could help it. Duncan and I have been able to be civil towards each other, she said. But what I really came to ask you is why Neil was the MC for the opening of the conference and not you. I thought we'd agreed that you'd do it. Elizabeth laughed. You didn't like that, did you? Not so much. It was for your own good, sweetheart. Neil started pestering me about his role in the proceedings, and I realized he intended to run for the council. Don't know that he would have been elected, but the Stillman name is familiar to so many, and he might have been. I convinced him that being on the council would be boring, but being the MC would be fun. He went for it. He's a born ham. Now I feel better. If I had to choose, I'd rather have him in the MC position than on the council. Her grandmother nodded. So would I. And we can't just ignore Neil. He's family. So I wanted to find a place for him where he couldn't do too much damage. I'm not sure that Howard would have put up with him on the council, and I was certain Howard would get elected president. Because you pulled some strings? I didn't have to. Elizabeth picked up her wine and took a sip. I would have if necessary. I know Cameron Gentry was your choice, but Kate, that has the moral fiber of a dry martini minus the olive. Howard is the better choice. I happen to think you're right. She thought of mentioning the incident with the sniffer leak, but once again decided that Neil would eventually hang himself, and she hated the role of tattletale. I love the WOW acronym, by the way. Kate sent her a sharp glance. Howard told you? Sweetheart, he tells me everything that's going on. He's like the younger brother I never had. You won't tell Neil though, right? Of course I won't. Howard mentioned the sniffer leak, and I've already talked to Neil. He denies giving the tidbit to Sapworthy, but I'm pretty sure he did. Both Howard and I should have realized he was close enough to hear our conversation. We'll be more careful from now on. Good. Kate hesitated, but they really did need to discuss this. There's one other thing, Grandma. What's that, sweetheart? Do you think there's anything to the rumor that Penny's going to make an appearance at the conference tomorrow? Elizabeth greeted the question calmly, so she was obviously aware of the rumor too. She stared into the fire. I hope not. Have you heard from her? No, she turned to Kate. Have you? Kate shook her head. Just that one email I told you about where she wished me good luck with the conference. Nothing more. Her grandmother sighed. I checked with your mother and father today and they haven't heard from her either. I wish they'd at least be willing to attend the conference for a few hours just to make an appearance. It's embarrassing that I helped organize this historic event and my own son and his mate aren't here. They're torn between Penny's choice and mine. They think if they make an appearance they'll be expected to take a stand one way or the other, and they can't see themselves doing that. Why do they have to take a stand? Elizabeth looked indignant. I haven't. Why should they? Kate loved her parents, but she understood their limitations too. They're not as strong as you are. I'm sure you've been confronted by those who demand that you pick a side. All the time. I tell them to bug off. I'm Switzerland. I'd even be willing to run interference for Woodruff and Violet if they'd only show up. They hate conflict. I know. She raised her glass in Kate's direction. To tough broads like you. Who can take the heat? Kate smiled. Thanks, Grandma. I'd better go. I do think you should offer him wine. We'll see. He warned me not to. What nonsense. He's a Scotsman. They can hold their liquor. I'll see how it goes. She walked over and kissed her grandmother on her smooth cheek. See you tomorrow. And personally, I think the conference is a smashing success. Elizabeth brightened. It is, isn't it? I hear the restaurant's bustling. Later on I'll go down and mingle at the bar, but I always enjoy my quiet time. And my wine. It rejuvenates me. Besides, it's good to maintain a certain mystique by absenting oneself now and then. One doesn't want to hang around as if there's nothing better to do. Kate laughed. You are my role model, Grandma Elizabeth. In that case you have to offer Duncan wine because in your boots I would make that the first order of business. I'll think about it. With a wave Kate left the room. Sally was at the door to show her out. I want you to see something. She unbuttoned the jacket of her maroon pantsuit. Underneath she wore a purple howler shirt. Kate gasped in delight. Then she stepped closer and dropped her voice to a whisper. Does she know? No. She was so adamant that the staff couldn't take sides, and I'm a member of the staff. But I'm a were female too, and I don't like the idea of human females horning in on our territory. Determination glowed in her eyes. You give that Duncan MacDowell hell, you hear? I will, Sally. She hugged the maid and left. As she walked down the hallway, she thought about the movement she'd started, and all those who believed in her, and in this battle to preserve the traditional werewolf way of life. Duncan might be the sexiest were she'd ever met, and she might crave his body, but wers like Sally were counting on her to fight for the cause. She couldn't let them down. Duncan discarded the idea of taking the elevator to the third floor in favor of climbing the magnificent wooden staircase instead. Each newel post was a carved wolf's head, and the broad stairs were carpeted in red brocade. Duncan loved everything about Stillman Lodge, from its rustic carved chandeliers to the gigantic stone fireplace in the lobby to the stained glass lamps in the pub-like bar. Several woofers had invited him for dinner in the lodge's magnificent dining room, but when he'd mentioned his assignment, they'd wished him well and promised to buy him a drink later when he was finished. As cozy as the bar was, Duncan didn't expect to be sitting in it tonight. If he and Kate finished before dawn, they would have their own celebration. He carried a small briefcase containing his laptop as he walked down the long hallway toward her suite. He'd spent a little time during a workshop constructing a rough draft of the mission statement. Since then he'd tried to concentrate on polishing it and had failed miserably. He was trying to focus on it now with no success whatsoever. Instead he was imagining what Kate might be wearing, and whether she'd let him even kiss her, or if they'd work across the room from each other and not touch at all. He didn't think that was possible. They'd become too close the night before to spend hours alone together now and not want to touch, to kiss, and to make love, damn it. God, but he ached for her. This was an impossible situation, but no one knew that except the two of them, or he certainly hoped no one did. He had a bad feeling that Jake had picked up on the chemistry between him and Kate in the way that only a potential rival would. From the first time he'd met Jake, he'd been on the alert, and not only because Jake supported the Howlers. Duncan had noticed how the Alaskan looked at Kate, as if considering whether to make a move, but he hadn't. Possibly because he'd sensed another male had already staked a claim. Duncan hadn't staked a claim, not really. He'd only made love to her once, and that was a far cry from staking a claim and miles away from binding her as his mate. Yet he'd reacted to Jake's interest with an inner snarl of warning. He had no right to do that, but Jake might have picked up on it. Bloody hell. That wasn't good. At the end of the hallway he found a set of carved double doors and a discreet brass plate with 3300 on it in elaborate script. Kate's suite was definitely in a higher rent district than his, which had a single plain door and was in the middle of the hallway on the first floor near the elevators. He supposed his room would be noisy at night, but he hadn't slept there yet, so he couldn't say for sure. Sleeping there tonight was unlikely to. Either he and Kate would work all night on the mission statement or they wouldn't, but he could see no scenario in which he ended up back in his own room. He had, however, tested out the shower not long ago. He'd also shaved and changed into jeans and a slate blue sweatshirt from his alma mater, the University of Edinburgh. He hoped the sweatshirt would inspire him to great heights of verbal genius. Yeah, right. Her suite had a doorbell and he pushed it. Chimes sounded inside and then she opened the door. For a moment they stood there looking at each other. He was glad for the chance to adjust to her beauty before they were behind closed doors again. As if they'd agreed on a dress code, she'd also put on jeans and a sweatshirt. Hers was gray and said Stillman Lodge, IST 1902. It included a line drawing of the lodge's exterior below the lettering, which curved around either side of her breasts. She'd put her hair on top of her head, and in a winsome touch, stuck a pencil in the top knot. He wondered how in hell he was going to keep his hands off of her. Come in. She stepped back from the door, and he noticed her feet were bare. He could understand the temptation to go barefoot as the soles of his loafers sank into the thick gray pile. Getting naked on a carpet like that would be a sensuous experience. He'd like the chance to find out. Go on in. She moved behind him to close the door. The food's here. He waited to hear the lock click into place behind him before he turned to her. I can already tell this is going to be difficult. I know. Her shirt quivered with her quick breaths. Go in and get some food. She made a shooing motion with both hands. That will take your mind off of sex. No, it won't. I wonder if. I mean it. She sounded slightly winded. Get in there and fix yourself a plate. He could smell the food, although her scent was the most important one to him. At the moment, she looked very earnest and determined, though. He turned and walked into her living area, his steps silent on the thick carpet. She had windows galore, including a big corner one to his left, and the curtains were open. Although it was dark outside, he could see a row of lights running down a snowy hillside. What are the lights for? Night skiing. The season came early this year, and they're still setting up. But they turned on the lights tonight, and I thought you'd enjoy looking out. Thanks. He was strung tighter than a hunting bow, and he made a conscious effort to relax his shoulders. Nice place. Very nice place. No walls divided the sparkling white kitchen on his left from the living area. To his right, probably so she could take full advantage of the views from every window. On the far right wall, a wood fire crackled in a decent-sized stone fireplace flanked by two tall bookshelves. A cushy red leather sofa and two easy chairs faced both the fireplace and a flat-screen television that was about twice the size of the one in his room. She'd set out the food on a bar-height counter that enclosed most of the kitchen area. Tall stools were spaced along one side. The view from the corner window had to be spectacular in the daytime. She'd fit a good-sized desk neatly into the space in front of it, and when she worked there she'd have a 180 panorama. He tried valiantly to look at her surroundings as a casual visitor might, but instead he saw everything in terms of whether it would be a good spot for sex. The carpet had already passed muster, and although the red leather sofa might be too slippery, he liked the idea of that cushioned surface. The desk once cleared had possibilities, as did the bar stools. His body grew hard as he catalogued the possibilities, and this wasn't even the main room for what he had in mind. Through a double doorway he glimpsed the edge of her bed. He just knew it was a king. A suite like this wouldn't have anything smaller. Let me take your briefcase so you can fix yourself something to eat. Holy hell. She was as aroused as he was. He cleared his throat. Look, I have an idea. She walked over to her desk and laid his briefcase on it. I know you do. She turned back to him and leaned her hips against the desk. I can see the evidence in the fit of your jeans. Don't be so smug. You're no better off. I know it. Her voice was a soft wail. I've tried to put sex out of my mind. It's like telling yourself not to think about a pink elephant and then that's all you can think about. I thought maybe if we ate some food. I don't care a thing about food right now, and neither do you. Her gaze met his. No, I don't. His heart thudded heavily in his chest. I think we should have sex and get it over with. You suppose that will work? I don't know, but I can hardly remember my own name, let alone what we're supposed to be doing instead of having sex. I need you something fierce. I guess we could try it. Turning toward the desk, she hit a button and all the drapes began to close as she walked toward him. Where? He could barely breathe from wanting her, let alone walk anywhere. His voice sounded like gravel running through a chute as he nudged off his shoes. Right. Here on the carpet would suit me fine, lass. Chapter 12. Werecon 2012. Delegates take time out for fun. Exclusive report for Werewolf Celebrity Watch by Angela Sapworthy. Denver. After a day packed with seminars and political jockeying, delegates to Werecon 2012 let loose with an old-fashioned romp in the snow where style and plan hatched in the Stillman Lodge bar resulted in more than 50 delegates shape-shifting and making use of the lodge's special wolf-friendly exits to hit the slopes, minus skis of course. This reporter couldn't help but join in the rambunctious free-for-all. Without shirts or slogans, political bias no longer mattered as all enjoyed the freedom to run and slide in the fresh snow with equal abandon. Although this reporter had to call it an evening after only a few minutes of the biting cold, she suspects many wers are still out there reveling in their freedom to simply be werewolves. The playful episode provides a brief respite for wers locked in a heated battle over whether to maintain our time-honored secrecy or risk revealing ourselves to the human community. That question will be the subject of tomorrow's final session, a much-publicized debate between HOWL leader Kate Stillman and WOOF leader Duncan MacDowell. For up-to-the-minute coverage of that historic event, follow me on Sniffer at Newshound. You'll have a ringside seat. Kate glanced around the suite as she evaluated the best way to set up their work environment. Her desk was big enough for them to share it, and she had another chair she could bring in from the bedroom, but that would put them tantalizingly close to each other. Bad idea. She turned to him. How about if I work and eat at my desk and you set your laptop up on the counter? There are outlets on the kitchen side of it so you can plug in. That sounds fine. Setting his plate down, he retrieved his briefcase and took out his laptop along with a trade paperback book. I brought you this. Don't feel obliged to read it, but I learned a lot from reading yours. She slid her plate back onto the counter and accepted the book with a pang of guilt. He'd been more open-minded than she had, and smarter too. They had a debate coming up tomorrow afternoon and she needed to have read this. She'd convinced herself she knew what was in it from following his blog, but that was lazy thinking. After spending time with him, she realized lazy thinking could get her annihilated in that debate. He'd done her a favor by bringing his book tonight. Thank you. She gazed at the cover. Down with Dogma, Benefits of We're Human. Cooperation was splashed across the bottom in vivid red type on a black background. Duncan's name was at the top, and in the middle a human profile faced a wolf profile, each outlined in red. Very eye-catching and dramatic. As I said, you don't have to read it. But I will. She glanced up. I should have read it before now, and not doing. That shows some arrogance on my part. In fact, when we debate tomorrow, you could have dinged me for not knowing what's in here. He shrugged. I'm sure you've been busy running your dating site and helping your grandmother plan this conference. I didn't read yours until I was faced with a long plane ride, so don't beat yourself up too much. All right, I won't. But handing me this tells me that you fight fair. Gee. opened the cover to see if he'd signed it, and sure enough he had. His inscription read, "To my worthy opponent Kate. Affectionately, Duncan." I debated whether that was too incriminating. Not if no one sees it but me. She closed the cover and looked at him. "And no one will. I like what you wrote. I'll treasure this. And I'll definitely read it before our debate." He returned her gaze. "I may have made a tactical error. I'd hate for reading my book to cut into your free time." She smiled. "Diplomatically put. I'm trying like hell not to come across as teasing and tempting. You're doing better, and I promise that given a choice between reading someone's book or spending quality time with the author, I'll take the one option every time." He chuckled. "Good. But if we have any chance of finding quality time, we'd better get cracking." Walking over to her desk, she laid the book on her desk. Then she hit the button to open the curtains. "Let's see what's happening outside." "Must we? With the lights on, anyone out there will be able to see in here better than we can see out there." Exactly. After reading that inscription, she was feeling way too mellow. About Duncan MacDowell. "You're a determined lass, I'll give you that." With a sigh, he came over to gaze out into the darkness lit only by the lights on the ski slope. "Am I imagining things, or are there a bunch of wolves out there playing in the snow?" "Are there?" She peered out toward the lighted slope. "That's what it looks like to me." Duncan laughed. "Whoever's out there, they're having one hell of a good time. Running and sliding. Whoops. That big one just wiped out. I wish we could, but we can't. Not until we have something to give Howard." But Kate watched the wolves with equal fascination. "How long since you've shifted?" He was standing close enough for her to feel his warmth and breathe in his scent. She should move away, but she liked standing here with him watching wolves. Too long. Like you said, I've been busy with HOWL, my dating site, planning this conference, keeping up with your blog. I forget about shifting. And the fun to be had. I can imagine how you'd look as a wolf, all blonde and fluffy. My best time to go out and be camouflaged is when the aspens are turning and dropping leaves. I blend right in. I'd love to see that. You might have if this early snowstorm hadn't hit. The leaves were beautiful, but now they'll all be gone." She glanced over at him. "Your coat is pure black, isn't it?" The urge to see him like that overwhelmed her. He would be magnificent, and she might never have the chance to find out. Black as night. I'd stand out in the snow like a blot of ink on a white page. But out here we're so isolated that it wouldn't matter. That's why everyone's having such a good time down there. It's safe." He looked at her. "You want to go out there, don't you?" "Of course I do, but we have an assignment to finish, as I believe I've mentioned at least 1,000 times. Or more." He put his arm around her shoulders and gave her a quick squeeze. He didn't linger, as if he wanted to make sure he wouldn't be accused of tempting her. "Let's tackle the job and get it out of the way. Then we can shift and go." She caught his excitement. "Let's do." "I would love that." "So would I. I haven't shifted in months. Stretching my muscles would feel good." "I'll get my food and a cup of coffee and we'll dive in." She headed back over to the counter, poured herself some coffee, and picked up her plate. "Same here." He followed her over, found a plug on the opposite side of the counter, and connected his laptop cord. "Did you come up with any wording during the day?" "I did, as a matter of fact." She walked back to her desk and turned on her computer. "How about you?" "Me too. I was a little bored in the session on werewolves through the ages, so I used the time to brainstorm." "Excellent." Kate located the scrap of paper she'd tossed on her desk when she'd come back to her suite at the end of the day. "Let's hear yours first." She picked up one of the cheesy snacks and popped it in her mouth as she glanced at him over her shoulder. "Maybe you should start." He poured a cup of coffee. "Ladies first and all that." She chewed her food and swallowed. "Okay." She didn't want to waste time discussing who went first. "Here it is, and remember, this is rough." "I understand." "Then here goes. WOW mission statement: to support the werewolf culture worldwide and protect its traditions, values, and unique benefits through networking and education." Duncan took a deep breath. "That sounds like you." She turned in her chair to study him. "How do you mean that? In a good way or a bad way?" "I'm not going to assign good and bad designations at this point." "You're being evasive, Duncan. You don't like it, do you? I didn't expect you to. It's not a matter of liking or not liking. You say some things in there that throw up a red flag for me, and I'm sure you know what they are. She did know. But she thought of Sally and of Jake. They expected her to stand firm. Let's hear yours then. We need to know how far apart we are. He cleared his throat and read from the screen of his laptop. WOW mission. Statement, to support the interests of werewolves worldwide and expand their influence through networking and unfettered communication with the human population. He stared at the screen and rubbed his chin. Comments. We're pretty far apart. Granted. But we have a few words in common. He laughed and shook his head. Damned few. She sipped her coffee. We have Wi-Fi hooked up. I'm going to send you mine. And you send me yours. Let's look at them side by side and see how they might be blended. He blew out a breath. It's worth a try, I suppose. Within a few seconds, she had his statement pasted under hers. If we have Wi-Fi, then we could also go on Sniffer from our computers, he said. Yes, but we're not going to do that. Howard asked us to move beyond howlers and woofers and get creative so we could hash this out. So let's go for it. 2 hours later, they were still haggling and Duncan couldn't see a solution. They'd eaten most of the food and what was left looked dodgy after sitting there for so long. They drained the carafe and the fire had burned down to a few glowing embers. Neither of them had attempted to build it up again, as if they both kept hoping they'd find a way through the maze and be done. Look, you have to give up that word protect, Kate. To words like Jake, it means some elaborate security system that hasn't even been invented yet. You heard how he went on and on about the database being a tool of the devil. And I'm not so sure it isn't. What if the wrong people got their hands on that database? They could hunt down and kill everywhere on the planet. It would never come to that. We have numbers, we have economic strength, and we have physical abilities like a superior sense of smell and hearing. We're experts at surviving, and you want to put us back into survival mode? We've been there, Duncan, and it's not pretty. You know the word I want you to get rid of? Unfettered. That implies dropping every safeguard, every precaution, and throwing ourselves on the mercy of the humans. That's nuts. I can't agree to anything that has the word unfettered in it. So here's what we have so far that we absolutely agree on. She blinked. We have something? Of course. I've been keeping track. Here's the mission statement with all the controversial parts taken out. WOW mission statement, to support werewolves worldwide through networking. That's a very short mission statement, Duncan. Granted, but we agree on every bit of it. Not hard when there's nothing to it. And now that I think about it, the term networking is suspect because it could be interpreted as suggesting that damn database networking was in your first rough draft. And I'm rethinking the use of it. Duncan groaned and laid his forehead on the counter. Now we're backsliding. I don't see any more wolves out on the hillside. Lifting his head, he turned around on his stool and looked toward the window. She'd left her chair. Hands shoved in the back pockets of her jeans, she was staring at a landscape shrouded in darkness except for that pale row of lights on the ski slope. They might still be out there. He climbed off the stool and went to join her. There could be romance happening in the shadows. Her breath caught. Duncan, you promised. You're right. Shouldn't have said that. But he'd been thinking about it ever since proposing that they take a run in the snow when they finished the damned mission statement. At this rate, he didn't think they ever would finish it. But saying that a miracle happened and they had a breakthrough, he'd love to take a run with her as wolves and then have a lusty bout of sex out there in the snow. Knowing the werewolf mentality as he did, others were doing that. Tonight, perhaps at this very minute. He realized that craving sex contradicted everything he stood for. He'd spent countless blogs blathering on about how unimportant sex was in the grand scheme of things. In his book, which she might read soon, he'd labeled the practice a primitive holdover from the old days. Yet he wanted to experience it with her. He longed to see her romping through snowdrifts, exotic in her blonde coloring with eyes bluer than the center of a flame. Then, when they'd run themselves until they were panting and pleasantly tired, he would take her as a male wolf takes a female. Warmth shot through his system and stiffened his cock. And he wasn't alone in thinking about sex. The scent of her arousal drifted toward him, exciting him even more. She took a long, shaky breath. Duncan, this isn't good. No, it isn't. I'm sorry. My fault. He forced himself to walk away from her. But like a restless wolf, he began to pace. It's not all your fault. I was thinking about it too. Let's change the subject. He continued to pace. Tell me why you're so against the database. Even if we don't have unlimited communication with humans as I envision, a central database would be a very unifying tool. Right. Now our information is incomplete, but if we had a database we could send out global messages and coordinate our efforts in ways we've never been able to do before. But it's too much like a registration system. I don't like it. We could have safeguards, install warning systems. If we had the slightest hint that someone was accessing it in order to round up werewolves, our network, which is still a very good idea by the way, would alert Wers to the potential danger. The carpet felt good under his feet, the only sensual pleasure he was allowing himself right now. Assuming a Wer was part of the network. But why wouldn't they be? She walked over to the counter, picked up the platters and took them into the kitchen where she began scraping them into the sink. A Wer might be listed in the database because she's the offspring of other Wers, but she might not be part of the network anymore, maybe by choice because of the risk of discovery. Then he understood. Like Penny. He stopped pacing and faced the kitchen area where she was working. It's one thing when powerful Wers like Aiden and Rourke Wallace take human mates. She scrubbed the platters vigorously, as if cleaning them would somehow help. In that case, the Wers protect the humans, and the humans, surrounded by so many Wers, are less likely to betray the werewolf community. But Penny. She stopped scrubbing and looked over at him. Penny's out there. Alone, Duncan. Instead of being surrounded by powerful Wers, she's surrounded by humans. You're right. It's different. You bet it is. Her expression was grim. If they discovered her secret, I don't know what would happen. Maybe Tom would try to protect her. I want to believe that he would. But he doesn't know her secret either, and he might feel betrayed and angry. Kate swallowed. I've had many nightmares about Penny. I'm sure you have. He liked to think he was an intelligent Wer, but he'd been missing a key point. Wer human mating, if it became a common practice, wouldn't be confined to powerful male Wers choosing human mates. And if female Wers chose a human mate and went to live among humans as Penny had, would it be safe to reveal their Wer nature? Not in the current environment, that was for sure. The culture still contained too many movies and books that depicted Wers as dangerous beasts who could turn a human into a werewolf with one bite. That had never been true, but it made a good story, and the myth had been repeated so many times most people believed it. Duncan realized that his utopian dream would take years of re-education before it had a chance of being realized. And thanks to Kate and her sister Penny, he had a perspective that hadn't been part of his thinking until now. He'd had male myopia, and he felt a little foolish having to admit that. I suppose you've figured out by now that I founded HOWL because of Penny, Kate said. I suspected that, at least on some level, but I hadn't really thought it through. I assumed you were mostly upset because she's no longer a part of your family. That's part of it. But I'm scared for her. And I don't want other female Wers running the risk she does, so I created my Wer-only dating site and founded HOWL for that reason. On the other side of the coin, if male Wers insist on hooking up with humans, then that reduces the number of eligible and safe mates for us. Duncan massaged the back of his neck where tension had taken up permanent residence. I hate to admit that I read that in your book, but it didn't really sink in. You were focused on the sex tips. He nodded. I fear so. What about you? She stacked the platters in a wire rack so they could drain. What inspired you to found WOOF? The question startled him. He couldn't remember being asked before. The easy answer is that I want to help create more freedom for Wers in all areas of life. But why? She leaned her hips against the kitchen counter. Did you lose the human love of your life because of Wer prejudice? No. At one time I told myself she was my soul mate, but when my brother Colin challenged me on that, I realized that she was only my way to make a statement. And why? I'm way ahead of you, lass. Why did I feel such a pressing need to make a statement? Because of the very thing you've accused me of, ego. My big brother is the laird with all sorts of responsibilities, very important in the grand scheme of things. I see. He was afraid she really did see, and he felt more exposed than ever in his life. but he trusted her in a way he didn't trust most others, and it felt good to get this out in the open. Plus he and my parents used to bitterly oppose human mating, so of course I had to come out in favor of it. She smiled. It takes a humble heart to admit such a motivation. I admire you for telling me, and I don't think your ego is nearly the size I used to imagine it was. Maybe you've helped me shrink it down to a reasonable size. There was some truth in that. She was good for him. Don't get me wrong. I believe in the cause. Inevitably Wers and humans will fall in love, and then you have that Romeo and Juliet scenario. I think it's past time that we figured out a way around that. Does that mean you're ready to tackle the mission statement again? He blew out a breath. No. You're not giving up, are you? I won't do that unless we run out of time, and we still have some. I think we've been cooped up for too long and our brains are fried. If everyone else has gone inside, let's go out and play in the snow. Before we've finished? She made it sound as if he'd suggested murder and mayhem. Howard told us to be creative, and I don't know about you, but my creative well is bone dry. Some fresh air and exercise is exactly what I need, and then I'll come back and ready to tackle that mission statement. As usual, you are a very convincing Wer. Does that mean you'll go with me? 'Cause even if you won't, I'm set on it. You can sit up here and beat your brains out trying to write that statement if you insist, but I'm heading for the slopes. Well, Howard did say we were supposed to work together. So let's play together for a little while, and then we'll be refreshed and renewed, ready for the task. Okay. She still sounded reluctant, though. He'd coax her out of that reluctance soon enough. His pulse quickened as he imagined them out there together. He might be rationalizing this decision to take a break because he wanted her so desperately, but they wouldn't stay out just long enough to play and have a different kind of fun. Then he'd put his nose to the grindstone. He had no choice. The clock was